The cold, polished finality in his voice was the last thing Emily expected to hear as she stood on the threshold of the home she had built, her bags scraping harshly against the hardwood floor before landing with a dull, definitive thud on the porch behind her. Mark didn't argue, didn't explain. He simply threw her out and walked away as if she had never mattered at all. The scent of the breakfast she cooked every morning still hanging in the air, a cruel ghost of a life now erased. From the doorway, Vanessa watched with casual delight, sipping from a mug that wasn't hers, her smile a slow, satisfied curve that spoke of plans long in the making. "Should have seen this coming, Em," she'd almost sung, the words dripping with a venomous glee. "Some people just don't fit where they don't belong." The door closed with a soft, final click, leaving Emily standing on the porch with the world tilting beneath her feet. The revelation that her name was no longer on the deeds, paper she'd signed blindly at Mark's urging, landing with the force of a physical blow. He had taken everything, the home, the savings he claimed were tied up in business, the very ground beneath her. With no family left but the memory of her grandmother, Grace, who had passed 3 years prior, and with a humiliating sob caught in her throat, she dragged her bags to a bus stop, each step a tremor of betrayal, ending up in a motel room that smelled of bleach and despair. In that numb, hollow space, with nothing but a few clothes and an old photo, she found a sealed envelope in her grandmother's old bag, her name scrawled in Grace's looping handwriting with a haunting subscript, "For when the world forgets your value." Inside was a dusty, heavy bank card, unlike any she had seen, with a single cryptic line on the back, "Use only when you're ready to start again." Desperation, a gnawing, empty ache for even a few dollars for food, propelled her to the gleaming glass doors of the Ridgeway Bank the next morning. The ordinary act of sliding the card to a young teller triggered a silent, seismic event within the institution. The screens flashed red, monitors went dark, and a low hum of alarms spread as staff whispered her grandmother's name like a forbidden incantation. The manager emerged, hands trembling, his voice a tense mix of awe and urgency. "Ma'am," he said, "the CEO wants to see you immediately." In that single bewildering moment, the woman discarded as trash became the axis upon which the entire bank seemed to pivot, escorted past rows of wide-eyed employees to a private elevator that ascended to a realm of frosted glass and abstract art she had never imagined entering. The office of Jonathan Pierce was a monument to power, all sharp lines and panoramic city views, and the man himself studied her with a disconcerting intensity as if she were a puzzle piece long missing. He revealed the impossible. Her grandmother, Grace Hathaway, the coupon-clipping, pie-baking schoolteacher, had been a founding investor and silent partner who owned 20% of Ridgeway Bank. The card was a key to a secured vault account, inactive for decades, and Emily, as Grace's sole heir, was now the recipient of a staggering inheritance entangled in bitter boardroom politics. "Your presence changes the balance of power," Jonathan warned, his tone carefully neutral. "Some will see you as inconvenient." He spoke of a bitter split, of Grace wanting to expose unethical practices and being forced out, of board members who had hoped the Hathaway line had ended for good. He authorized temporary access to funds, a sum that made her dizzy, and advised her to stay in public, to trust no one privately, not even him. The warning echoed in her mind as she left, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The outside world offered no refuge. Her phone buzzed with Mark's call, his fake concern curdling into anger as he demanded to know about her bank visit. "You're still my wife," he claimed, but the lie shattered when she confronted him about the perfume, about Chloe, Vanessa's friend. His guilty silence was confirmation, and then Vanessa herself materialized on the sidewalk, delivering the coup de grace. "You were becoming a burden." The confrontation was short, vicious, and designed to break her, but as Vanessa walked away expecting collapse, Emily felt something shift inside, a cold, hard anger crystallizing where humiliation had once resided. This new anger was a new spine, holding her upright. Yet the day descended further into its chilling reign. She found her old car towed, her last belongings in bags by the curb of her motel, the manager citing unpaid fees with a shrug of indifference. Sitting in a leaking bus shelter, clutching her grandmother's car that still refused to yield its promise, she was approached by a nervous man in a Ridgeway lanyard who called himself Arthur. He pressed a worn manila envelope into her hands, his eyes darting. "Be careful who you trust," he whispered urgently before melting back into the downpour. "Especially the ones who seem to be on your side." Inside the envelope was a photograph that stopped her heart. A younger, vibrant Grace stood shaking hands with three men in front of a half-built Ridgeway bank sign. Two of the men were Jonathan Pierce and, with a lurch of nausea, her mother's father. On the back, a hurried, angry scrawl. "They betrayed her once, don't let them do it to you." The pieces, jagged and terrifying, began to lock into place. This was not a simple inheritance. It was the legacy of a betrayal that had roots deep in the bank's foundation, roots that now entangled her own marriage. The footsteps she heard approaching turned out to be benign, but the fear they ignited was a constant companion through a sleepless night spent in her car, the storm her only lullaby. By morning, determined for answers, she returned to the bank, only to find the atmosphere transformed into one of open suspicion. The executive elevator was locked, and she was swiftly ushered by security into a glass-walled conference room for a remote board meeting. Jonathan, now distant and formal, sat among stony-faced board members who spoke of alleged inheritance and improper access, officially challenging her claim and freezing all assets. The betrayal was swift and surgical. "I said we would review the situation," Jonathan stated coolly, his earlier warmth a discarded mask, "and now we are." Cast out once again, numbed with a deeper, more institutional betrayal, she sought out Arthur, only to learn from hushed employees that he resigned overnight, his profile erased, a ghost for handing her the truth. Then the legal assault began, an email from Mark's lawyer alleging emotional damages and theft of confidential documents, a clear setup from the belongings Vanessa had rummaged through. A final, chilling text from an unknown number: "You should have stayed quiet." Cornered in a park, her world collapsing in layers, she received two voicemails. The first captured Mark arguing with an unknown cold voice that stated, "She doesn't know anything, not yet." The second was clearer. "We'll find out soon enough. The board's already turning against her. Pierce won't defend her. She's alone, just like her grandmother." The message was a knife to the last of her hope. They knew Grace. They were watching her, and they were working together. Driven by a desperate need for sanctuary, for any connection to the grandmother who seemed to have lived an entire secret life, Emily navigated to the derelict community center Grace had loved. In a forgotten storage closet, behind a loose wall panel, she found a rusted metal box. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, was the original shareholder agreement that solidified Grace's controlling interest, and a handwritten letter. Grace's words, firm and loving, flowed from the page. "They will come for you. Stand tall. You come from women who don't bend for bullies. The only people afraid of your power are the ones who relied on you never discovering it. Don't let them shrink you, Emily." The letter was a lifeline, an infusion of ancestral strength. As she absorbed its power, the crunch of gravel announced an intruder. Mark's voice echoed in the hollow building, demanding the documents. She slipped out a back exit, heart pounding, and fled to the bank, the agreement and letter burning a hole in her bag, her fear now fully forged into purpose. She stormed past stunned guards and a flustered assistant, riding the elevator to the boardroom where a heated vote was underway. Throwing the doors open, she halted all proceedings. "I have the original shareholder agreement," she announced, her voice steady in the ringing silence. "The one you all pretended didn't exist." She placed the document on the table, detailing how Grace was pushed out for refusing illegal practices. The room erupted, but she held firm, exposing Jonathan's complicity in the cover-up. Then Mark burst in, furious and desperate, claiming the documents were his. She met his rage with cold proof, presenting bank records of his embezzlement and fraud, the fabricated lawsuit laid bare. As security restrained him, the board, faced with irrefutable evidence, voted unanimously. Jonathan Pierce was removed, the Pierce shares suspended, and interim control was handed to Emily Hathaway, the rightful controlling shareholder. When asked to appoint the next chair, she did not hesitate. I appoint myself. In the aftermath, she directed the legal team to press charges against Mark and investigate Vanessa's schemes. Arthur was reinstated, and a full audit of the bank's practices was launched. Sitting in the CEO's office, now hers, as the city lights glittered beyond the windows, Emily unfolded Grace's letter once more, reading the final, resonating line. Power isn't about money. It's about knowing who you are when they try to take everything from you. She placed the letter in the dress drawer, a sacred artifact of her rebirth. The woman thrown out with nothing, deemed useless, had not just claimed an inheritance, she had reclaimed her own soul, stepping into the power her grandmother had preserved for her. The world that had tried to break her now had to make space for her. And in that quiet, triumphant moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the possibilities of the future, Emily Hathaway knew she would never be defined by anyone's estimation but her own again. The silence that settled over the office was profound, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of raised voices and crumbling empires that had just echoed through the boardroom. It was a clean, hollow silence, the kind that follows a storm, where the air itself feels washed and new, charged with the potential of what must be rebuilt. Emily remained seated, her hands resting flat on the cool, black glass of the desk that was now hers. She did not feel a surge of exhilaration, nor the giddy triumph one might expect. Instead, she felt a deep, resonating calm, a tectonic settling within her spirit. The frantic, hunted creature from the bus shelter was gone, shed like a skin. In her place sat a woman who had stared into the abyss of her supposed worthlessness and had found at its very bottom the unyielding bedrock of her grandmother's faith and her own rediscovered fortitude. The city sprawled beyond the windows, a vast grid of light and shadow. And for the first time, she did not look at it as an outsider pleading for a place to belong. She looked at it as a stakeholder, as someone whose decisions would now ripple through its concrete veins. The intercom on the desk buzzed, a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet. It was Jonathan's assistant, Lydia, her voice now stripped of her former professional condescension, replaced by a wary deference. "Ms. Hathaway? The legal team is assembled in conference room A as you requested. Also, a Mr. Alastair Croft from the Securities and Exchange Commission is on hold. He says it's urgent." Emily absorbed the information without a flicker of surprise. The news would be traveling at the speed of scandal. "Tell the legal team I'll be there in 10 minutes, she replied, her voice even, carrying an authority that felt both foreign and innate. "And put Mr. Croft through to me now." She expected regulatory eyes. The downfall of a bank CEO and the allegations she had just unleashed were not quiet affairs. As she waited for the connection, her gaze drifted to the photograph she had placed beside the computer, the one from the metal box of a younger, determined Grace. It was no longer a relic of a mysterious past. It was a compass. Alastair Croft's voice was a dry, precise instrument, devoid of unnecessary warmth. He confirmed receipt of anonymously submitted materials pertaining to historical lending practices at Ridgeway and the recent leadership upheaval. He spoke of a preliminary inquiry, of scheduled interviews, of the bank's obligation to cooperate fully. Emily listened and then responded with a clarity that surprised even her. "Mr. Croft, Ridgeway Bank welcomes your inquiry. You will have our complete and transparent cooperation. In fact, I am initiating a full independent forensic audit this afternoon, the results of which will be shared with your office. My grandmother founded this institution on principles of ethical fiduciary duty. It is my intention to return it to those principles, whatever the cost. There was a pause on the line, a slight shift in the bureaucratic tone. That is an unusually proactive stance, Miss Hathaway. It's the only acceptable stance, she said simply. After arranging a follow-up meeting, she ended the call. The path was clear. She would not hide, she would not obscure, she would wield the truth Grace had preserved like a scalpel, cutting out the rot. The meeting with the legal team was a study in shifting loyalties. The head of the department, a man named Charles Whitaker, who had served under Jonathan for 15 years, presented a carefully neutral face, but his eyes held a calculating wariness. They discussed the immediate actions, formalizing the board's vote, securing the transfer of control, handling the press inquiries that were already flooding the switchboard, and dealing with the impending charges against Mark and the investigation into Vanessa. Emily listened and then leaned forward. Before we address any of that, there is a prior matter. The employee Arthur Finley. His termination yesterday was illegitimate and retaliatory. I want him reinstated immediately with full back pay and a formal apology. Furthermore, I want every HR action for the last 5 years reviewed, focusing on any dismissals or pressures applied to employees who raised concerns about ethical practices. Whitaker blinked, momentarily thrown. Miss Hathaway, with respect, that is a vast undertaking. The internal focus should be on stability. Stability built on fear and silence is corruption, Emily interrupted, her tone leaving no room for debate. We start with Arthur. Today. See to it. It was her first executive order, and it sent a silent, seismic message through the room. She was not there to maintain Jonathan's regime, she was there to dismantle it. The hours bled into one another, a whirlwind of signatures, briefings, and difficult conversations. She met with the heads of every major department, looking each person in the eye, assessing not just their competence, but their character. Some, like the head of community lending, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, met her gaze with a spark of hopeful defiance, as if she had been waiting decades for this moment. Others offered polished platitudes, their eyes darting, already calculating how to survive the new regime. Emily took note of it all. She authorized Maria to begin a full review of all small business and mortgage loans from the Pierce era, specifically looking for patterns of discrimination or predatory practices. If we find them, Maria asked, her voice tight, what then? Then we make reparations, Emily said. We restructure the loans, we apologize, and we publicize what we've done. The cost will be the cost of our integrity. Amidst the storm of corporate triage, a different kind of message arrived. It was an email from her former landlord, the motel manager. Attached was a photograph of her 2 sorry bags, now cleaned and placed neatly in a storage room. The message read, "Saw the news, had no idea. Your things are safe here whenever you want them. No charge." It was a small, human kindness that, in the midst of the high-stakes battle, brought a sudden prick of tears to her eyes. It was a reminder that the world was not monolithic. It contained both Vanessa's and motel managers, both Jonathan's and Arthur's. She typed a brief, grateful reply, then turned her attention to the most pressing personal logistics. She needed a home. Using a small fraction of the now accessible interim funds, she contacted a reputable, discreet realtor and arranged to view secure, furnished apartments later that evening. She would not return to the motel. Not as a refugee. She would step into a space of her own choosing. As dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, a different visitor arrived. Lydia announced him with palpable nervousness. "Miss Hathaway, a Mr. Finley is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment." Arthur looked older under the harsh office lights, his shoulders hunched as if still expecting a blow, but there was a new light in his eyes, a mixture of relief and fierce vindication. "You didn't have to do that," he said, the moment the door closed, his voice rough with emotion. "The reinstatement, the apology." "Yes, I did," Emily replied, gesturing for him to sit. "You took a risk for me, for Grace.
He nodded, swallowing hard. I worked in archival compliance. For years, I'd see fragments, redacted memos, sealed meeting minutes from the early days. Your grandmother's name was always there, followed by a black bar. Jonathan had a standing order. Any query related to Grace Hathaway was to be routed directly to him. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. She was a threat. When you showed up with that card, I knew they'd try to do to you what they did to her, bury you in procedure and doubt until you disappeared. He reached into his worn messenger bag. After they walked me out, I went home and dug this out. It's not much, but it's more than they have. He slid a slim file across the desk. It contained photocopies of internal memos from 22 years ago, discussing the Hathaway problem. The language was corporate and cold, but the intent was clear. Neutralize her influence, consolidate voting blocks, encourage her retirement. One line was circled. P. Caldwell assures us the family pressure will be effective. Mark's father. The final piece of the conspiracy clicked into place. It wasn't just business, it was personal. The Caldwells had helped destroy Grace to secure their own position, and Mark had married her granddaughter, perhaps seeing her as a harmless remnant to be controlled, a living monument to their family's victory. Emily thanked Arthur, her voice thick. "Will you help me?" she asked. "Not as an archivist, as a special assistant. I need someone who knows where the bodies are buried and isn't afraid of the dark." Arthur's answer was immediate. "For Grace," he said, "and for you." The viewing of the apartment was a surreal interlude. It was a sleek, high-floor condo with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a dizzying view of the city she was now poised to influence. It was beautiful, empty, and silent. As she walked through the pristine rooms, she felt a disconnect. This was a trophy, a symbol of the power she now held, but it was not yet a home. She signed the lease anyway, a practical necessity, but made a mental note to bring the photo of her and Grace at the county fair to fill the space with something that spoke of roots, not just elevation. Returning to the bank late that night, the building was a cavern of shadows and hushed emergency lighting. Her footsteps echoed in the marble lobby as she made her way back to her office. She had one more task to complete. Sitting at the desk, she opened a new document and began to type. It was not a corporate memo or a legal directive. It was a personal manifesto, a letter to her grandmother. She poured out the events of the cataclysmic day, the confrontation, the evidence, the fall of Jonathan and Mark, and the reinstatement of Arthur. She wrote of the fear, the anger, and the strange, solid calm that had followed. "You were with me," she typed, tears finally streaming down her face unchecked in the private dark. "Your words were my armor. They tried to make me small, and you taught me how to stand tall. I will not let them forget you. I will not let this institution forget what it was supposed to be." She saved the document to a private encrypted drive, a digital talisman to match the physical letter in her drawer. As she saved the file, her email pinged. It was from a private investigator she had hired hours earlier, on a gut instinct. The subject line was, "Vanessa Caldwell, Financials." The brief report was illuminating. Vanessa's interior design business, which had always seemed so prosperous, was deeply in debt, sustained only by a series of large, irregular transfers from an offshore holding company. The holding company, upon a shallow layer of digging, was linked to a shell corporation that had received several consultancy fees from Ridgeway Bank during Jonathan's tenure. The connection was a thread, thin but strong. Vanessa hadn't just been Mark's accomplice out of spite, she had been a paid one. Emily leaned back, a cold smile touching her lips. Vanessa had believed herself to be a player, but she had been merely a pawn in a larger game, one where the chessboard was now under new management.
The next morning began with a press conference. Emily stood at a podium emblazoned with the Ridgeway logo, flanked by Maria Rodriguez and a stony-faced Charles Whitaker, who had clearly decided his survival depended on apparent cooperation. She looked out at the sea of cameras and reporters, their faces hungry for scandal. She did not give them melodrama. She spoke calmly, clearly, and without teleprompter aid. She confirmed the change in leadership, framed it not as a coup, but as a necessary correction. She acknowledged the SEC inquiry and announced the independent forensic audit and the internal review of past lending practices. Ridgeway Bank has lost its way, she said, her voice carrying through the silent room. It prioritized profit over people and consolidation over conscience. That ends today. My grandmother, Grace Hathaway, helped found this bank on a promise of community and ethical stewardship. I intend to honor that promise, no matter how difficult the path. She took no questions, ending the conference on her own terms. The headlines would be brutal. The stock would likely tumble, but she had seized the narrative. It was a story of redemption, not just ruin. In the days that followed, the machine of reform groaned into motion, resisted by inertia and hidden pockets of loyalty to the old guard. The forensic auditors arrived, a team of unsmiling men and women with forensic laptops and bottomless cups of coffee. Department heads were required to submit full transparency reports. Whistleblower protections were strengthened and publicized internally. Emily spent her time in a grueling rotation. Morning briefings with legal and compliance, afternoons and strategy sessions with department heads she was beginning to trust, evenings reviewing the cascading documents from the audit. She moved into the Stark apartment, and Arthur helped her hang the county fair photo in the living room, a small splash of joy and memory against the minimalist backdrop. A week after the boardroom showdown, she was reviewing loan files with Maria when Lydia interrupted, her face pale. "Miss Hathaway? Jonathan Pierce is here. He's insisting on seeing you. He says it's about your grandmother." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. She exchanged a glance with Maria. "Send him in," she said, her voice steady. Jonathan entered, looking like a man who had aged a decade in days. The impeccable suit was still there, but it hung on him slightly. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out desperation. He did not sit. "Emily," he began, then corrected himself. "Miss Hathaway, I suppose congratulations are in order." "That's not why you're here, Jonathan," she said, remaining seated, forcing him to stand like a supplicant. He flinched at her tone. "No, I'm here because you need to understand the full story. About Grace, about why I—" He trailed off, struggling. "You made your choices," she said coldly. "He made them for me." The outburst was sudden, raw. "My father and Patrick Coldwell, Mark's father. I was young, ambitious, terrified of him. The plan to force Grace out, it was their plan. My role was to manage the board, to use my relationship with her to soften the blow, to make it seem like a mutual retirement. But she wouldn't bend. She threatened to go public with everything. The forged risk assessments, the predatory loan quotas. So they escalated. They didn't just take her shares, they smeared her. Anonymous tips to the press about mental instability, about embezzlement from her own charity. They broke her spirit, Emily. And my father made it clear that if I didn't stand with them, my career, my future would end before it began." He sank into a chair now, the performance gone, leaving only a shattered man. "I have lived with that cowardice every day since. When you walked in with that card, it was like seeing her ghost. I thought if I could control the situation, if I could manage you, I could somehow contain the past. But you are her, through and through. You're stronger than I ever was." Emily listened, her heart a conflicting tumult of fury and pity. The monster had a history, a chain of fear that explained, but did not excuse. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "Because the investigation is getting close to older things my father and Patrick did that make the forced retirement look like a kindness. There were loans to shell companies that funded operations that were not legal. Grace found out. That was the real reason she had to be silenced. The smear campaign, the pressure, it was all to distract from that." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I will testify. I will give the SEC and your auditors everything I know, every document I've hidden. In exchange,
in exchange for some consideration for my family. My wife knew nothing. My children. His voice broke. Emily studied him for a long, silent minute. The power dynamic had utterly inverted. He was offering her the keys to the deepest vault of corruption, the truth that could truly cleanse the bank and vindicate Grace completely. But it came with a price, complicity in a different kind of deal. You will testify fully and truthfully without any pre-negotiated immunity. You will hand over every piece of evidence, every name, every date. The legal consequences will be what they are, but I will ensure the public narrative distinguishes between your actions then and your cooperation now, and I will see that your family is not targeted by the press. That is the only grace you will get from me. It was a cold, judicial mercy. Jonathan nodded, a tear tracing a path through his stubble. It was more than he deserved, and they both knew it. After he left, Emily walked to the window. The city was there, vast and uncaring. She had the truth now, the whole ugly, sprawling truth. It was heavier than she had imagined. The fight was no longer just about claiming an inheritance or righting a single wrong. It was about excavating a decades-old malignancy. She thought of Grace, not just as her grandmother, but as a woman, alone in a paneled office much like this one, surrounded by men she had trusted, seeing the trap close around her. She hid the documents not for revenge, but for this exact moment, for the heir who would be strong enough to wield them. The responsibility was crushing and sacred. That evening, instead of burying herself in more files, she did something unexpected. She left the bank and took a cab across town to the old community center. It was locked, but the caretaker, recognizing her from the news, let her in with a respectful nod. She walked through the silent gymnasium, past the stage where Grace had directed countless school plays, and into the small, shabby library. She sat in the very chair Grace had always favored, a worn, upholstered armchair by the window. The setting sun streamed through the dusty panes, painting the room in gold. Here, surrounded by the smell of old books and waxed floors, she felt Grace's presence not as a ghost from a photograph, but as a living warmth in the air.
The woman who had owned a fifth of a financial empire had chosen to spend her hours here, in this room, building a different kind of wealth, one of connection, creativity, and quiet dignity. Emily understood now that her inheritance was dual: the fierce, combative legacy of the boardroom warrior and the deep, nurturing legacy of the community steward. One without the other was incomplete. She returned to her new apartment with a settled purpose. The battle ahead was daunting. The SEC investigation would be long and intrusive. The forensic audit would uncover horrors that would make headlines and test the bank's stability. Civil lawsuits from those wronged by the bank's past practices were inevitable. Mark's criminal trial would be a public spectacle, and Vanessa, cornered by the financial trail, would likely turn on everyone to save herself. It would be a marathon of stress, scrutiny, and difficult decisions. But Emily Hathaway was no longer afraid. She had been stripped, betrayed, and hunted. She had faced the abyss and found herself waiting there, forged in her grandmother's image. She had a team, however small, that she was beginning to trust. She had the unassailable power of truth, patiently preserved for her, and she had finally learned the lesson the world had tried so violently to teach her. Her worth was not in a deed, a bank balance, or a man's approval. It was in her courage to face the storm, her integrity to choose the harder right over the easier wrong, and her resilience to rise, again and again, from whatever ashes they tried to bury her in. She turned off the light and looked out at the glittering city, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. The story of the woman thrown out with nothing was over. The story of the woman who rebuilt everything, for herself, for her grandmother's memory, and for the people the bank was meant to serve, was just beginning. And she was ready to write it, one honest, unwavering word at a time. The quiet that settled in the apartment after the revelations of the day was a stark contrast to the clamor of the city below, a city that seemed to buzz with a new energy, a whispered current of change that emanated from the very tower she now inhabited. Emily stood at the expansive window, not seeing the intricate grid of lights, but seeing instead the labyrinthine path that lay ahead. Jonathan's confession had not provided closure, it had opened a deeper, darker chasm. The older things he'd alluded to, the illegal operations funded by the bank's shadowy loans, hung in the air like a toxic mist, threatening to poison every victory she had just claimed. Grace hadn't just been pushed out for being ethical, she had been silenced for stumbling upon a crime. This transformed the narrative from a corporate power struggle into something with the potential for criminal conspiracy, drawing a line that connected the polished boardroom to places she could scarcely imagine. The weight of it was immense, a geological pressure on her newfound resolve. She was no longer merely a CEO righting a financial wrong. She was potentially an unearther of felonies, with all the danger that entailed. The next morning, the bank's atmosphere was charged with a new, brittle tension. The press conference had set a tone, but Jonathan's unannounced visit and the subsequent discreet arrival of federal agents from more agencies than just the SEC signaled that the ground was shifting at a tectonic pace. Emily met with the lead forensic auditor, a severe woman named Dr. Eris Thorne, in a secure conference room. Thorne spread out preliminary charts on the table, her finger tracing lines of transactions that snaked through a dizzying network of offshore entities. "The patterns are not just aggressive," Thorne stated, her voice devoid of inflection. "They are deliberate obfuscation. Loans were approved to seemingly legitimate foreign import-export firms. The capital was then moved, sometimes within hours, through a series of shell corporations in jurisdictions with no transparency laws. The trail goes cold here," she pointed to a node labeled Vega Holdings Cyprus, and here, Polaris Trust Caymans. But the initial funds, the seed capital for these labyrinths, all originated from a handful of large Ridgeway loans authorized by a committee chaired by Jonathan Pierce and signed off on by Patrick Caldwell. She looked up at Emily. "The timing coincides precisely with the period of your grandmother's most vocal opposition to the bank's international expansion strategy. She wasn't just a nuisance, she was a forensic accountant's nightmare for them." Emily absorbed this, the cold, hard data giving form to Jonathan's terrified hints. What were these firms supposedly importing? Thorne's lips thinned. On paper, agricultural equipment, medical supplies, industrial parts. The documentation is impeccable and entirely fabricated. Our international counterparts are investigating, but preliminary whispers suggest the capital was used for arms trafficking and resource extraction in conflict zones, bypassing international sanctions. The room seemed to grow colder. This was the malignant core. Patrick Caldwell and Jonathan's father hadn't just wanted Grace's shares. They had been using the bank she helped build to fuel enterprises that would have sickened her. Her opposition wasn't about ethics in the abstract. It was about being an accomplice to bloodshed. "How do we prove it?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We follow the money backwards," Thorne said. "We need someone on the inside of one of these chains, a whistleblower. Or," she paused, "we need the architects to turn on each other. Jonathan Pierce is a start, but the Caldwells, they built these walls. Patrick is dead. Mark may not have been involved in the old schemes, but his father would have insulated him. The knowledge likely died with Patrick unless," Emily finished, "it was documented." A new, urgent priority clicked into place. Mark's home office, the Caldwell family estate, anywhere Patrick might have kept a record of his triumphs and his sins. Obtaining that would be legally fraught, but the criminal investigation now provided a path. She immediately convened a meeting with Charles Whitaker and the head of the bank's security, a retired FBI agent named Leo Walsh. She presented Thorne's findings, watching the color drain from Whitaker's face. Walsh, a man with the calm demeanor of a cliff face, simply nodded. "We need to secure any and all physical and digital assets connected to Patrick Caldwell that might still have ties to the bank," Emily directed. "Coordinate with the federal investigators. Petition for warrants based on Thorne's evidence. I want a legal team working on this around the clock. The bank will not hide. It will lead the charge in exposing this."
As the machinery of investigation whirred into a higher, more serious gear, the personal front erupted. Vanessa, backed into a financial and legal corner by the PI's report and the bank's severing of all ties, made her move. She didn't come through lawyers. She arrived at the bank's lobby, her usual polished veneer cracked, demanding to see Emily. Security held her, but Emily, after a moment's consideration, had her escorted to a neutral meeting room, with Leah Walsh observing remotely. Vanessa looked diminished without her backdrop of smug certainty, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's.
"You think you've won," she spat, but the venom was weak, diluted by fear. "You've just opened a door you can't close." "What do you want, Vanessa?" Emily asked, her tone glacial. "Immunity," she blurted. "A settlement, no charges. Mark is going to throw me to the wolves to save himself. He's already blaming me for the document theft, for manipulating him. I have information about his father, about where Patrick kept his real books." Emily leaned forward, every sense sharpened. Talk. Vanessa's story tumbled out in a self-serving rush. Patrick Caldwell had been paranoid, distrustful of digital files. He maintained a physical, encrypted ledger, a old-fashioned, leather-bound book where he recorded the true nature of his special projects, including the routing numbers, contacts, and profit distributions for the offshore schemes. He called it his insurance policy. According to Vanessa, after Patrick's death, Mark had taken possession of it, but, disgusted by its contents, or fearing it, had never opened it. He kept it locked in a safe behind a false panel in the library of the Caldwell family home, a house that was now in legal limbo due to the divorce and Mark's legal troubles. "He doesn't understand what's in it," Vanessa whispered, "but I do. He told me once, drunk and angry, that it was the family curse. Give me a deal and I'll tell you exactly where the safe is." The information was a potential goldmine, but dealing with Vanessa was like handling a live wire coated in poison. Emily made no promises. "Your information will be evaluated. Any consideration you receive will be based on its veracity and your full cooperation with the authorities, not with me." She had Vanessa escorted out, then immediately contacted the federal prosecutor now leading the expanded investigation. Vanessa's testimony, motivated by self-preservation, could provide the probable cause for a warrant that the financial trails alone might struggle to secure quickly. The following 48 hours were a blur of coordinated legal strikes. Warrants were secured for the Caldwell estate, for Mark's downtown apartment, and for all of Jonathan Pierce's personal devices and storage units. The news vans gathered outside the gated Caldwell property as FBI agents, accompanied by bank representatives and forensic accountants, entered the imposing stone mansion. Emily watched the live news feed from her office, her heart a steady, heavy drum in her chest. In the library, behind the described false panel of oak, they found the safe, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth as if it were a relic, was Patrick Caldwell's ledger. Its contents, when decrypted and analyzed, were a roadmap to a decade of concealed crime. The ledger didn't just confirm Thorne's analysis, it named names, listed dates, amounts, and shipping manifests for dual-use technologies that had ended up in war zones, and detailed kickbacks to sanctioned oligarchs. It was the insurance policy that had now bankrupted his legacy. The ledger also contained a final, chilling entry dated just weeks before Grace's forced retirement. "GH cannot be reasoned with. She has traced the Venezuela conduit. The moralizing is a cover. She understands the exposure. The pressure must be total. PC agrees the family lever is the best option. The son is pliable." The son was Mark. The family lever was the systematic financial and emotional manipulation that would lead Mark, years later, to marry Grace's granddaughter, perhaps as a final, twisted act of control or a perverse sense of securing the loose end. Emily read the transcript, feeling physically ill. Her marriage had not been an accident of love gone wrong. It had been, on some level, a continuation of her grandmother's persecution, a living monument to the Caldwells' victory.
The personal and the corporate conspiracy were not just parallel, they were the same serpent coiled through 2 generations. With the ledger in hand, the investigation accelerated at a breathtaking pace. Jonathan Pierce, true to his word, but under the immense pressure of irrefutable evidence, began a full, tearful cooperation, implicating not just his deceased father and Patrick, but several other now retired board members and a network of international bankers. Arrest warrants were issued. The name Ridgeway Bank was in every headline, but now coupled with historic fraud uncovered and new CEO leads cleanup. The stock price plummeted, then began a shaky, volatile recovery as analysts noted the unprecedented transparency and cooperative stance of the new leadership. Amid this maelstrom, Emily made a quiet, private pilgrimage. She drove to the cemetery where Grace was buried, a simple plot under an old oak tree. She placed a single white lily on the grave and stood there in the spring breeze. She didn't speak aloud, the words felt insufficient. Instead, she let the truth settle between them, the full, ugly, victorious truth. They're gone, Grandma. The house they built is falling down, and we are holding the ledger. Your name is cleared. It's more than cleared, it's revered. The wind rustled the leaves, and in that moment she felt not just peace, but a transfer of stewardship. The fight for vindication was over. The harder work of rebuilding had begun. Returning to the bank, she faced her greatest leadership test yet. The forensic audit was complete, revealing a staggering liability, not just from potential fines, but from the moral debt owed to communities harmed by the bank's past discriminatory practices. She called a special meeting of the remaining shell-shocked board members and the heads of every major department. In the boardroom, now stripped of Pierce's intimidating art, she laid out her plan. It was radical. She proposed the establishment of a legacy reconciliation fund, capitalizing it with a significant portion of the bank's remaining liquid assets and all recovered funds from the ongoing lawsuits against the implicated former executives. This fund would not be for shareholders, it would be for restitution, refinancing predatory loans at 0 interest, providing grants to communities whose development had been stalled by the bank's discriminatory practices, and funding financial literacy programs. She also announced the immediate end of all business with jurisdictions known for secrecy laws and a total restructuring of the international division to focus solely on transparent, ethical trade finance. This will cost us, she stated plainly to the board. Our profitability will suffer in the short term. Our stock may take years to recover, but we will have something money cannot buy: integrity. And from that, a different kind of strength will grow. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. The message to the world was unequivocal. Ridgeway Bank was under new management in spirit as well as in fact. In the weeks that followed, Emily's life attained a strange, strenuous rhythm. Her days were consumed by the monumental task of institutional rebirth. Her evenings were spent in her apartment, which slowly began to feel less like a hotel and more like a home, especially after Arthur helped her install a bookshelf filled with Grace's favorite novels and her own growing collection on corporate ethics and economic justice. Mark's criminal trial began, a sordid affair where Vanessa, having secured a minimal plea deal, testified against him with vicious efficiency. Emily did not attend. She read the summaries, felt a distant pang for the shattered illusion of the man she loved, but mostly felt a profound detachment. He was a chapter, painfully closed.
One evening, as she worked late reviewing plans for the community grant program, Lydia announced a final visitor. It was Maria Rodriguez, holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I thought you might need a reminder that not all meetings have agendas," Maria said with a smile. They sat on the floor of Emily's office, looking out at the city, and talked not about loan-to-value ratios, but about their families, about Maria's abuela, who had also been a fierce woman, about the neighborhoods they hoped the grant program would transform. It was the first real, unguarded human connection Emily had allowed herself in what felt like an eternity. Later, alone again, she opened the top drawer of her desk and took out Grace's letter. She read it once more, the words now imbued with the lived experience of the past tumultuous months. Power isn't about money. It's about knowing who you are when they try to take everything from you. They had tried. They had taken the house, the husband, the security, the dignity. And in taking everything, they had inadvertently given her the one thing she needed most, the unshakable knowledge of her own strength and the clarity of her grandmother's purpose. She placed the letter back, her hand resting on the desk. The journey from the porch to this office had been a via dolorosa of betrayal and revelation. But the woman who now sat in the CEO's chair was not the same woman who had been thrown out. She was a composite of that woman's resilience and her grandmother's fortitude, a custodian of a painful truth and an architect of a hopeful future. The path ahead was long and would be lined with challenges: shareholder lawsuits from those opposed to her radical restitution, the arduous task of changing a corporate culture, the personal loneliness that came with such a singular position. But Emily Hathaway was no longer afraid of the long path. She had learned to walk it in the dark, guided by a legacy of light. She turned off the lamp, and in the dark office, illuminated only by the city's endless glow, she smiled, a small, quiet smile. The story of the heir was complete. The story of the steward, the rebuilders, was now, fully and finally, her own. The city's glow was a silent, sprawling witness to the quiet transformation occurring within the glass tower that anchored its financial district. For Emily Hathaway, the frantic, adrenaline-fueled days of unmasking and confrontation had subsided into a different, more profound kind of labor, the meticulous, brick-by-brick work of reconstruction. The Legacy Reconciliation Fund was more than a line item on a balance sheet. It was a moral audit made manifest, and its administration became the central axis of her new existence. She appointed Maria Rodriguez to lead it, granting her an autonomy and budget that made the old guard accountants blanch. But Emily was immovable. "We are not asking for permission to be ethical," she told a tense budget committee. "We are executing the mandate this institution abandoned." The first public town hall for the fund was held in a community center much like the one Grace had loved, in a neighborhood that had been redlined by Ridgeway decades earlier. Emily stood before a skeptical, weary crowd, not behind a podium, but on the same linoleum floor. She presented the data of past wrongs, the denied loans, the inflated fees, not as a distant corporate history, but as a specific, addressable ledger of harm. She announced the first initiative. A team of bank employees and community advocates would review every mortgage application from the area that had been rejected in the previous 15 years, with the presumption of approval unless legally disqualified. The silence that followed was heavy, then broken by a slow, disbelieving clap from an elderly man in the front row. It was not a victory celebration, but a fragile bridge of trust painstakingly built. Back at the bank, the culture shift was a daily negotiation. Arthur, now her official chief of special projects, was a relentless bloodhound, his reinstatement a symbol that silenced many would-be dissenters. Together, they implemented GRACE protocols, mandatory transparency disclosures for any investment over a certain threshold, an ethics hotline with guaranteed anonymity and external oversight, and a restructuring of bonuses to reward long-term community impact over short-term profit. Each policy was met with resistance cloaked in practicality. "The market won't understand this," argued the head of investor relations, a man named David who had thrived under Jonathan's regime. Emily's reply was patient but final. "Then we will educate the market. Our prospectus will now have a section on ethical fiduciary duty, and we will find investors who value that. If we lose some, we lose them." They did lose some. Several large institutional investors pulled their phones, causing another dip in the stock. But a fascinating thing began to happen. A new class of investor emerged: socially responsible funds, impact investment groups, even a consortium of faith-based organizations who saw Ridgeway not as a fallen giant, but as a rare, radical experiment in corporate penitence and reform. The stock stabilized, then began a slow, steady climb on a new foundation.
The personal landscape of her life, however, remained starkly austere. The apartment, with its breathtaking view, often felt like another beautifully appointed office. She existed on a diet of takeout salads and late-night reports, her social life confined to work dinners and strategy sessions. One Saturday, driven by a need for something tactile and real, she visited a farmer's market, something she and Grace had done every weekend. The simple act of selecting tomatoes, of smelling basil, of exchanging a smile with a vendor felt like a homecoming to a self she had almost forgotten. She filled her kitchen with real food and made a silent promise to cook one proper meal a week, a ritual to anchor her humanity. This small act of self-care proved fortuitous, for the following week brought a new, deeply personal challenge. She received a formal letter from a law firm representing Mark, now awaiting sentencing. It was not a legal threat, but a request. Mark, from his confinement, was asking, through his counsel, to see her, just once. He claimed he had things to say that were for her ears only, pertaining not to the case, but to their past, to Grace. Emily's first instinct was a furious, visceral no. Every cell in her body recoiled at the thought of being in the same room with him, of allowing his voice to intrude upon her hard-won peace. She discussed it with Leah Walsh, who advised extreme caution, and with Arthur, who simply said, "Sometimes you have to look the ghost in the eye to stop it from haunting you." She wrestled with it for days, Grace's voice in her head. Don't let them shrink you. Fear of seeing him was a form of shrinking. Curiosity, she told herself, was not. It was intelligence gathering. She agreed under a strict set of conditions. It would be in a secured visitation room at the detention center, with a federal observer present, unseen behind glass, and it would last no more than 15 minutes.
The Mark who sat across from her in the sterile, buzzing room was a pale imprint of the man she had married. The polished confidence was gone, eroded by fear and orange polyester. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a hollowed-out awe, as if she were a natural disaster he had narrowly survived. "You look powerful," he said, his voice scratchy. She said nothing, waiting. He cleared his throat. "I'm not asking for anything. I know what's coming to me. I need you to know that it wasn't all a lie. At the start." Emily remained silent, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. He floundered under her gaze. "My father, he talked about Grace like she was a disease the bank had recovered from. When I met you, I didn't make the connection, not at first. You were just Emily. Kind, gentle. You made me feel like I could be something other than his son. But when he found out who your grandmother was..." Mark's hands clenched on the table. He was delighted. He said it was poetic control, that having you was the final proof that the Hathaways were meant to serve the Caldwells. He started pushing me, grooming me to take over his role on the board, to use my marriage as leverage if you ever became difficult. I hated it. I loved you. But the pressure, the money, the expectation, it was easier to become what he wanted. And Vanessa, she was part of his plan too, a friendly face to guide me, to report on you. He looked down, ashamed. The affair with Chloe was a test he set, to see if I was cold enough to do what was needed. I failed it, but not in the way he'd hoped. I just got sloppy. Emily listened, dissecting his confession. It was a story of weakness, not of evil, which in some ways made it more pathetic. He was a pawn who knew he was a pawn, but lacked the courage to tip himself off the board. "Why tell me this now?" she finally asked, her voice cool and clear in the small room. "Because you beat him," Mark said, looking up, a spark of something like grim satisfaction in his eyes. "You beat his ghost. You found the ledger, you tore it all down, and I'm glad. I'm rotting in here, but I'm glad it's you who did it. It means she didn't lose. Grace. It means the good guys won." There was a twisted, desperate sincerity in his words. He was seeking absolution, not from her, but from the narrative itself. He wanted to be a footnote in her victory, rather than the villain in his father's story. Emily stood up, the chair scraping loudly.
The good guys don't need your endorsement, Mark, and I don't need your closure. My grandmother's victory was secured the day she decided to hide the truth for someone stronger than the people trying to bury it. That strength had nothing to do with you then, and it has nothing to do with you now. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. Good luck with your sentence. She walked out without looking back, feeling not catharsis, but a final, clean severance. The ghost, once looked in the eye, had no power. It was just a sad, hollow man. The encounter, instead of destabilizing her, solidified her resolve. She threw herself even more deeply into the work of the fund. They approved their first batch of loan reversals, and she insisted on hand-delivering the approval letters with Maria. The faces of the families, the stunned relief, the tears were a fuel more potent than any stock rally. She was not just running a bank, she was facilitating reparations, and the human impact was a constant, humbling reminder of the real stakes. This tangible progress, however, drew the attention of a different kind of adversary. One afternoon, a sleek, worrying report landed on her desk from Leo Walsh. It detailed a coordinated short-selling attack on Ridgeway stock, coupled with a smear campaign in fringe financial blogs accusing the legacy fund of being a socialist wealth redistribution scheme and questioning Emily's mental stability, dredging up the old, false claims that had been used against Grace. The language was too specific, the timing too coordinated to be random. It's the old network, Leo said grimly. The ones who haven't been indicted yet, the offshore partners who lost their pipeline. They're trying to scare off our new investors and cripple us before we become a sustainable model that others might follow. It was a move from the shadows, an attempt to kill the rebirth with whispers and financial sabotage. Emily's response was twofold, blending Grace's defiance with a new strategic acumen she was developing. First, she went public, not defensively, but proactively. She called a press conference and directly addressed the short sellers and the blogs. Attacks driven by anonymity and fear are the tactics of a dying order, she stated, looking directly into the cameras. They are proof that our new path is the right one and that it threatens those who profited from the old, hidden ways. Ridgeway will not be intimidated back into the shadows. Our books are open. Our mission is public. We invite scrutiny of our actions, but we will not dignify attacks on our intent with anything but continued action. Second, she and Arthur worked with the new ethically aligned investors to create a stabilizing consortium, a white knight fund that would buy up the aggressively shorted stock, turning the financial attack into an opportunity for her allies to deepen their stake. It was a high-risk gambit, but it worked. The short squeeze that followed cost the shadow attackers millions and demonstrated that the new Ridgeway had teeth and powerful friends. In the aftermath of this victory, a strange package arrived at her apartment, with no return address. Inside, nestled in foam, was a small, exquisite porcelain figurine of a lighthouse, the kind Grace had collected. A note, typed on a plain sheet, read, "A beacon draws fire from the darkness, but it also guides the lost home. Well lit, Miss Hathaway." It was unsigned, but Emily knew. It was from someone in the old network, someone perhaps having a crisis of conscience, or someone who respected a worthy adversary. She placed the lighthouse on her bookshelf next to the photo from the county fair. It was a warning and a tribute, a testament that her light was now seen, for better or worse, in corners of the world she would never visit. As autumn began to crisp the air, the first major review of the Legacy Fund's impact was published. The numbers were promising, but modest. Hundreds of loans restructured, dozens of small businesses launched with seed grants, thousands of hours of financial counseling provided. The financial press, initially skeptical, now ran features titled, "Can a Bank Heal Itself?" and "The Hathaway Experiment, Profits with a Purpose." Emily was invited to speak at prestigious forums, not just as a CEO, but as a philosopher of a new capitalism. She used every platform to talk about Grace, not as a victim, but as a visionary whose blueprint for ethical finance had been decades ahead of her time. On the anniversary of the day she was thrown out of her home, Emily did something symbolic. She bought the motel where she had spent that first desolate night.
not to tear it down, but to renovate it completely, transforming it into transitional housing and a career training center for people, particularly women, escaping financial abuse or homelessness. The manager who had shown her kindness was promoted to oversee the project. At the groundbreaking, she took a moment alone on the patch of asphalt where she had parked her towed car. She remembered the feeling of the world being empty, of being weightless and worthless. She placed her hand on the cold ground, then stood, brushing off her pants. She was not that woman anymore. That woman had been a necessary chrysalis. That evening, she finally cooked that proper meal, a recipe of Grace's for vegetable stew. The apartment filled with savory, comforting smells. As she ate at her small table, looking out at the city, her phone buzzed with a calendar alert for the next day. Board meeting, quarterly review. Once, those words would have filled her with dread. Now, they were a reminder of her stewardship, her accountability. She had a board to lead, a fund to grow, a model to prove. The work was endless, but it was hers. She cleared her plate, washed the dish, and walked to the window. The city's endless lights shimmered, a galaxy of human striving and struggle. Somewhere down there was a woman sitting on a porch with her bags packed, feeling the world end. Somewhere was a young girl clipping coupons with her grandmother, learning quiet strength. And here, in this space between, was Emily Hathaway, the bridge between those 2 points. The story of the victim was archived. The story of the avenger was concluded. Now unfolded the patient, enduring, and hopeful story of the builder. A story with no dramatic final act, only the constant, committed choice, day after day, to use power not as a weapon, but as a tool, not as a crown, but as a responsibility. The beacon was lit. The work, her true inheritance, had only just begun.